Hello, welcome back to Skyrocket Automotive. This is something I've decided to start called Saturday Club. That door gets locked, no customers, me, these little beauties, and you guys. And every weekend, we're just going to shoot the shit. Talk about the exciting and wonderful world of keeping classic cars running. Some days it will be talking through pros and cons of things. Other days it will be explaining how to fix things or how things work. Sometimes we'll just chat. So today, done a lot of K-Jet stuff. We'll get to the K-Jet stuff later in this video, don't worry. Computer controlled fuel injection. I do that too, just not the modern stuff. My model year cut-off point is about 2002. What we have here is a very sweet little car and a very rare little car. This is a mini sidewalk. It was a limited edition, very cool interior, a few other bits. It's got what's called an SPI engine, and SPI stands for single point injection. So basically, it's got what you could consider an electric carb on it. Let me show you what I'm talking about. That scary looking thing just there is effectively a computer controlled carburetor. There's a throttle mounted low down. And that strange thing that looks a bit like a Minion, frankly a deserving fate for Minions as far as I'm concerned, put them in an intake manifold and cover them in petrol. That's a fuel injector. It's basically a sprinkler. And these get a little bit complex, but they're tangible. That's the difference. You don't have 6 million different sensors, everything's got its own job. It's very easy to wrap your head around what's going on. Case in point, fella is in because he failed his MOT test miserably on emissions. And as you can hear, it's an A series and it runs quite nicely. Unfortunately, this engine is up to temperature right now and we've got no temperature gauge. Yeah, I'm not technically in work today. The reason you guys always see me in black is because whenever I get an opportunity to wear colour, I dress like a 5-year-old. I've got no colour sensibility at all. Leave it. So I put it to you like this. I'm not against computer control, necessarily. It's just that we already did it in a much more repairable way 25 years ago, 30 years ago at this point. I'm getting old. I'll explain it to you. You'll see what I mean. First thing I checked for, always, with everything, anything that's got a running problem, just check for vacuum leaks. Won't take you long. Even on a Peerberg, it won't take you that long. And see how you go. I found one on this. This little barb here was rusty-tosty, so changed it. One problem down. We've got no temperature gauge. This vehicle is running at 6%, which is a lot. There's a little chink in the armour. On the underside of the intake manifold, there's a sensor. And very much like the Volkswagen carburetor engines, they've got the intake manifolds have got coolant flowing through them. And what happens is, well, they can get full of crystallised coolant. The coolant level could get low, airlock. That heat helps to vaporise the fuel. There's also a temperature sensor in there. And that's got its finger on the pulse of the temperature of the engine. Now, where things get different, that sensor feeds temperature information to the ECU. So the ECU knows what the temperature is before you do. That allows the ECU to adjust fuel in, idle speeds, all that sort of stuff. Once it's done everything it needs to with that information, sends it off to the temperature gauge. If our temperature gauge isn't working, it stands to reason there's something wrong with our wiring, there's something wrong with our sensor, there's no coolant for the sensor to temp sense. So, lo and behold, I took the radiator cap off. Frothy. I'll put a picture up now, Kyle. So the cooling system's full of foam. I then topped it off with fresh coolant, Super Cold Master, and the coolant's brown. So I think either the intake manifold coolant passages are clogged up and it can't get an adequate reading, or our sensor's dead. Bad news, because if our temperature sensor's dead, manifold's got to come off. And I don't like doing SPI manifolds. They're a pain in the ass. Wiring between the sensor and the ECU, internal fault at the ECU, wiring between the ECU and the gauge. If it's wiring between the ECU and the gauge, we should still not have a rich condition. It shouldn't still be idling as fast as it is. This isn't me talking at you and trying to explain how to fix cars all the time. That temp sensor, that's a pretty tangible thing when you think about it. What I'm trying to say is we've had easily repairable computer controlled fuel injection for a long time at this point. I know modern fuel injection is done for emissions purposes, for the environment, but I put it to you that modern cars and modern engines are under so much strain chasing those emissions that they don't last as long, so they go in the bin. These might not be as clean burning as a modern fuel injected vehicle, but they're still around and they can be fixed. The other thing I would say is please don't discount a classic car just because it's got an ECU, because a lot of it is still very tangible. You work through the steps and you get there. That's a little introduction. Let's get on to the K-Jet bit, which is what you guys are here to see. Where's that fuel distributor gone? Come on, where'd you go? I was going somewhere with the intro. That's where we got to. The next step after that was multi-point injection, and very efficient. For example, I've got a 2002 MGZS multi-point injection. That's ULEZ compliant, and that's a 2002, and that system was developed in the 80s, and by the mid-90s, I would say it was fully implemented. Obviously, you had the Pagumfi engine, the Honda D-Series, for example, that had PGMFI, programmed fuel injection. All the same gear, just as repairable. Logical. Yes, okay, the ECUs aren't as communicative as they are nowadays, but where did we get the bright idea to do fuel injection from in the first place? KJet. Prior to this, it was D-Jet. D stands for druk, which is pressure. Just butchered that pronunciation. You should expect no less from me at this point. Things really kicked off when Bosch developed the K-Jetronic fuel injection system. Ingenious. Basically, K stands for, brace yourself, continulich, just properly f that up as well. It stands for the German word for continuous. How K-Jet works is you have an injector per cylinder and they spray all the time, continuously. CIS is also what it's known as in America, and that stands for continuous injection system. But I had a question on the Storm video when we got it running as to what I was talking about between control pressure and system pressure. This is a fuel distributor. You've got your ports for your injectors. That port goes to a thing called a warm-up regulator, which I'll get onto in a moment. And then your fuel comes in. You've got the plunger. This is the guy that tried to burn my workshop down. So I will strip down and do an autopsy on this, so I'm not going to take it apart on camera, I want to be careful. I don't want to destroy a perfectly good fuel distributor if it's easily fixed. You have two separate layers to this, like an ogre. Your fuel pressure builds up, and there is a single very fine port up through into the top of the fuel distributor. And basically, the way these work, that plunger that blew out on us the other day gets lifted. You've got the metering disc, the thing that had the air filter chunk on it. If you imagine it's an arm like that, as the air gets rushed in when you open the throttle, it lifts the metering disc and pushes on this plunger, which is normally sat much further down than this. As you can see, it's decided to seize itself back in while it's been sat. But that lifts that plunger, and the plunger is shaped like that. The fuel wants to make it from the bottom chamber to the top chamber and out into the injector lines, and the plunger allows that to happen in varying degrees. It works kind of like a throttle. The fact it's restricting is what means it works. As the fuel comes through, up and out the injector lines, you need something to counterbalance that, because otherwise, every time that metering disc lifts, it can launch the plunger right up to the top of the travel, send full fuel in. So we have a thing called control pressure. So system pressure is the pressure required to open the fuel injectors and keep them there. Control pressure is a counter pressure that tries to force the plunger back down to say, no more fuel. And the way we regulate mixture, how do we do chokes? We do chokes very straightforward on a KJet engine. We lower the amount of pressure. It's as simple as that. The less pressure in the top of this housing, the more easily the plunger is able to be lifted, the more fuel comes out, the richer the mixture relative to throttle position. As the engine gets hot, the pressure increases via our warm-up regulator, which I'll show you in a moment, which means that plunger is being forced down more aggressively, which means that it can't be lifted as readily, thus less fuel for the same amount of air, leaner mixture. And it really is that straightforward. Getting it to do that can be tricky, but it's relatively straightforward. System pressure is adjusted via this pressure regulator. This is a good time to talk about what pressure is, and I'm not patronising you, it's just easier to get your head around things. That was cold. Lorry. It's easy to forget. Pressure is a resistance to flow. So if you're hounding a load of petrol in, it's like squeezing a hose pipe, basically. If you're hounding a load of fuel flow in, but there's no resistance to flow, the pressure is low because the fuel's able to just cycle round. There's a lot of it,
You may get a little bit of pressure from all of that fuel trying to squeeze through the line. But to really generate pressure, you need to restrict things. That's how K-Jet gets its system pressure. It's got a very powerful little fuel pump that sits under the car that blasts fuel in, and then most of the fuel that passes through this fuel distributor is going back to the tank. K-Jet works on having too much fuel available at all times, and then anything that's not needed gets sent back to the tank, which in most running conditions is most of the fuel. How do we regulate pressure? With a pressure regulator, of course. We've got a piston on a spring, which screws into this union here. That's a return line back to the tank. The fuel wants to come in and go back home. But with that pressure regulator in place, it restricts the line. The pressure increases until there comes a point where it pushes the plunger back, and then it can get back to the tank. Once that happens, the fuel pressure drops down and the plunger closes and brings the pressure up. The difference being is, something to remember, it would be thrashing around, which is not good because you get cavitation. It's so finely tuned that there's a point where the valve is open and it reaches like an equilibrium state where there's sufficient fuel going back to the tank to hold the plunger open, but not so much fuel going back to the tank that the plunger can overcome that pressure and go back again. And if there are any problems, the plunger can close, pressure can rise, and this all happens in it's a split-second thing. This and your accumulator under the car, they're basically the same thing. It's a resistance to fuel flow. That's pretty much all you need to know about a fuel distributor, in all seriousness. So when you adjust the mixture on a K-Jet car, you aren't adjusting anything here. What you're adjusting, the mixture screw sits between the fuel distributor and the metering disc, down here. And what you're actually adjusting is the height of the arm relative to the disc. So if you want to enrich the mixture, it works like a jack-in screw. The screw goes through two halves. If you wind the mixture up, the metering disc stays where it is. If you wind the mixture up, what you're doing is spreading those two arms apart, which lifts the arm, which raises the plunger, but the arm stays in the same place. Richer mixture. If you want to lean it off, then it lowers the plunger. And that's it. You preset it, and they do their job together in tandem. Very hard to cock up K-Jet as long as you're careful. It's a repairable system, it's a serviceable system, it's a bloody good system. Everybody used K-Jet. K-Jet is a very important part of automotive history. It's the first time fuel injection was viable on a mass production scale. Everybody used it. Volvo, obviously you had the PRV engine, so the PRV engine, Peugeot, Renault, Volvo was PRV. That V6 was in everything. It made it into the DeLorean DMC-12. Don't at me with bullshit about the DeLorean. They're lovely cars, they drive nicely. They might not be the fastest thing in the world, but they do drive well. Anyone who's actually driven one will attest to that fact. So K-Jet, not only did it improve emissions, because you could more accurately gauge your fuel quantities, but it also improved performance because it was running more efficiently. To give an example, a lovely easy example, you've got two engines in the later type Scirocco's, carburetted and fuel injected, EX, DX. Those engines are absolutely identical in every way. The guts of those engines are the same engine. The only difference is the fuel system and a slightly more aggressive advance curve on the distributor to take advantage of the more efficient fuel system. An EX engine, when new, made 90 horsepower. A DX engine made 112 horsepower. That's a massive difference. When you're we're not talking a 600 horsepower engine making 620 horsepower. That's an appreciable difference at that level. 90 horsepower versus 112 feels major. You also got a nice upswing in torque because, again, there was no bogging. A properly set up K-Jet engine, there's no bogging. And you got better fuel economy for the most part. You seldom saw better fuel economy in a GTI car because they got thrashed everywhere. But theoretically, it could be done. They are a very reliable fuel system, as long as people don't dick with them. I hope that answers your question with regards to control pressure. Let's go to the car and I'll show you.
Okay, what's awesome to know is that Ted is still retaining some fuel pressure, which is great. There's our fuel distributor in situ going off to the injectors, and there's our metering disc. That whole thing as an assembly is called a metering head. Down there, those two fuel lines in the center of the screen is a warm-up regulator. And what that does, that feeds in to the top of that fuel distributor. When the engine's cold, the pressure's low, and you'll notice the warm-up regulator is mounted on the block. The reason for that is so that it doesn't go rich needlessly when you've parked the engine for a few minutes. The heat from the engine keeps the control pressure high. So the way a warm-up regulator works is you've got just a round pad, fuel in, fuel out, two small holes, and a diaphragm. The diaphragm has got a pin to the back of it. When the control pressure is low, because there's very little resistance, as we've already discussed, that pin is away from the diaphragm and the fuel is able to belly out the diaphragm slightly, and that keeps the pressure low. As the engine heats up, there's a bimetallic strip with a pin and a spring, and as the bimetallic strip gets hot, it relaxes, which allows the spring to push on that diaphragm, which squashes the diaphragm up, and that restricts the flow, which raises the control pressure. That's it. There's no computers, there's no thinking, it's all done with hot air, pressure, and the odd bimetallic spring / switch. To first start a KJet car in the morning, obviously you want to build pressure. They used to have a prime function. MOS had prime function. I explained how that works in that MOS video actually. It's very clever, it's a little 555 timer. The closest thing to an ECU that K-Jetronic fuel injection has is a single 555 timer in the fuel pump relay, whose job it is to detect when you first flick the ignition on, it primes the pump. When it's getting constant signal from the coil, the pump's on, and when you turn the engine off / you stall the engine, i.e. you've had an accident, it detects that fact and turns the fuel pump off. That's it. It's not really a computer, it's more of a logic array, which technically is a computer. We're not getting into that. What I'm saying is, you haven't got an ECU that's monitoring temperatures every 5 minutes and going, oh, hello, oh, here we go, need to lean off a bit, advance the timing, retard the timing. What's the oxygen sensor saying? Okay, none of it. It doesn't think. And that's even more impressive to me, because it's a machine, entirely automated machine, old school, no computers. What I find most interesting is the cold start process on a KJet car, because that also has no computers. That is done with a temp sensor. And when I say temp sensor, I mean a sensor with two wires that makes or breaks a contact depending on whether it's hot or not. So you flick your key on, pump primes. Fuel gets up to the 5th injector. It's actually a cold start valve. Because when you say 5th injector and someone goes, well, I've got a V8. Well, I've got a V8, so what number's that? It's a 9th injector, don't be a dick. But it's actually a cold start valve. It's an electrical fuel injector. It's got power, it gets 12 volts when you're cranking on the engine, and only when you're cranking on the engine on the majority of vehicles. We'll get into enrichment in another video, it's too deep for today. When you crank the starter motor, it sends 12 volts to the cold start valve. Now, you don't want to be spraying raw fuel into your intake manifold when the engine's hot, or even warm, really. It's a first, get things alive. It's so clever. The power comes into the fuel injector, the cold start valve, comes out to a thermo switch, which is mounted in, sometimes it's mounted to a coolant flange, oftentimes it's mounted to the block. If that switch is hot, breaks the ground. If it can't ground, it can't fire. If the switch is on, it's because the engine's cold. When you're cranking the key, 12 volts to that injector, sprays the fuel, starts the engine. To assist in further emissions control, it also, that little temperature sensor, has a heater built into it. And if all else fails and your engine block is still freezing cold when you first start the engine, but the guts of the engine don't need extra fuel, that heater will heat that temperature sensor up for you. Amazing. They thought of everything. They really did think of everything. As far as our choke, we've got our cold start valve, which gets us rolling. We've got our richer mixture because of our lower control pressure. Fast idle.
because you need fast idle because the fuel isn't atomizing correctly in a cold engine yet. You need heat, some heat, not too much, but you need enough heat to get the fuel to vaporize correctly, atomize correctly. How do you do that? Very simple. There's a thing called an auxiliary air valve that sits on the back of the engine, also has a heater to it, and it is a round disc, about yay thick, with an air port, not Gatwick, and it basically bypasses the throttle. So it's a controlled air leak basically, and what happens is when you look through it, you've got your big round disc with your your port there, there's a flap, and the flap is attached to another spring, another heated bimetallic spring, and it lets air through, and as the engine warms up, it comes through and closes that port. And as that comes down, obviously the tighter the restriction, the lower the engine idle because there's less air getting through, until you reach your hot idle speed. That's it. That's it. Cold start. Done. Initial burst of fuel, fire the engine up, richer mixture, higher idle speed, and then everybody just settles down together as the engine warms up. And at that point, that's it. I know I may be grossly oversimplifying things. I'm not giving you numbers, I'm not giving you specs, because that's not what this video is about. This is a rough outline to get you interested, or just answer any general questions you might have about how it works. K-Jet, fascinating. Could talk about it all day. And there were a lot of other versions of K-Jet later on in life. It lasted a very long time. You see a lot of mid-90s cars still running a version of K-Jet. There was a CISE system. There was K-Jetronic. We went on to L-Jetronic eventually, which, now let me get this right, I think it might also be known as Motronic. They might be two different things. But what I'm saying is, there came a point where the Jetronic system also started having a say in ignition timing, and then we were talking. That's when we really started to get cute with our fuel injection systems. Ignition timings and our emissions and our tunes and as much power as we could make for the cleanest burn we could get. And that took us all the way up to ECU control. So that's a brief history of classic car fuel injection. I know I glossed over K-Jetronic. I will do a video on each of these systems eventually, but that's not what today's about. This is low energy, let's relax. It's a Saturday. I'm at work, but I'm not at work because I'm working when I'm working and I'm working when I'm not working. I hope it's a suitable random video for the end of the week. May not do one of these every week. It might just be like an occasional thing. But I hope it was interesting and I hope it was chilled. I also hope you have a lovely weekend and thank you very much for watching. I also hope that I can now clear out this coolant channel on this Mini and hopefully get the gauge back, because otherwise I'm taking the manifold off. And that's not a job for today. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any further questions about anything I've talked about in this video or any opinions, let me know down in the comments, because it's something I can then answer in the next Saturday Club. And also, as always, please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you again.